Welcome to Confessions in Quarantine. This is the Reverend A.T. Kegler, and today we're doing a quick digression from our normal order of things. Those of you who follow along know that we've been going point by point through the small catechism. Well, today we're going to be going on a case study of Lutheran civics and Lutheran ethics. We'll be doing this through the COVID-19 vaccine and some of the recent mandates that have been becoming more and more common through the Biden administration. We're going to be discussing this in Christian, particularly Lutheran terms, how we can understand what's going on and how we are called to respond to it. I'm not approaching this from a civic angle. I'm not trained in the law or in the Constitution, but rather in Lutheran theology. I think that's a much more helpful way of discerning how we are actually called to respond. So this perspective is shaped by the Book of Concord. It's shaped by a few of Luther's additional writings, such as his letter on whether Christians can flee from a deadly plague, as well as, interestingly enough, for you Lutheran theology junkies, his admonition to peace. With these things together, I think we get a pretty good perspective of how we're called to act as Christians. I'll also be talking a little bit about our theology of vocation and, of course, our theology of government. Now, to get started, I actually do think we need to start with what Lutherans believe government is and what it's called to be. So, let's get started. To begin with government, though, we need first to understand that there's a thing called law. Law precedes earthly government, and the law has a few uses in the Lutheran tradition. 2, maybe 3, but for the purposes of this video, primarily the first. God made law, more or less, for the restraint of evil and the protection of life through love, power, and justice. This is what we call the first use of the law. It's the restraint of evil and the protection of life. Sometimes we can call this the office of the sword, though I think using the word sword is a little reductionistic. Law has more power than simply violence. There are other ways that we can do law stuff that doesn't strictly rely on the sword, even if that is one really effective tool in doing it. Just for clarity's sake, there are one, maybe two additional uses of the law. The first one is the second use of the law. It reveals the fact that we're sinners, and thus that we need forgiveness and grace. This is the law as a mirror. It shows us that we come up short. And in so doing, it invites us to receive the gospel. This is the second use of the law, the theological use of the law. The third use of the law, if we are to describe it as a third use of the law, it is what happens after you've received the gospel, that is, after the second use of the law has worked, and grace has been revealed and given, that sins have been forgiven. When you receive the gift following the second use, this third use of the law is more or less to approach the first use of the law in a new way, to see it not as something to condemn or something that you're forced to do, but rather as a gift and a guide. The Lutheran confessions teach us that the first use of the law is given to people, and the people who are given the authority to exercise the first use of the law, to restrain evil, are in fact our authorities. The primary authority is first the office of the parents of a family, and that will in turn extend to earthly government. So this first use of the law to restrain evil, first given to the parents who create community, who establish the primordial community, that is the family, and then kinship, tribes, lands, governments, etc., nations. The first use of the law is an obligation that is put upon authority figures. It's given to all earthly governments, not just quote-unquote good ones. It's not limited to one society or the other. There isn't one holy government up and against all other ones, but literally all governments on earth, in the universe, all governments have this fundamental responsibility to care. God is always, throughout Scripture, telling people, governments, how to be a holy community, how to do the job well. It's never just like certain kings or certain judges, but even when the law is given to particular people, they're given that law to be a beacon to show how the rest of the world how to work. And indeed, we see the principles of the first use of the law working throughout the ancient biblical world and in fact throughout today. God hasn't stopped using the first use of the law, but God continues to make use of it and to give people the use of it for the establishment and the preservation of life. No one graduates from the first use of the law. You never move away from the first use of the law. It's always active throughout the world around us, and we're always called to it. We find that the prophets of the Old Testament are often correcting kings and judges and all sorts of civil authorities, whether they're the kings of Judah or whether they're kings in like Babylon and stuff like that. God is always working through people trying to bring a more just and more life-establishing world. God has a mode of operation for kings, even though God expects kings to come up short. And God's preferred image for a king is that of a shepherd. All kings, all governments are called more or less to act as good shepherds, not bad ones. We see this perhaps most clearly the case in Isaiah 44, where God literally calls Cyrus, the king of Persia, who's decidedly not Jewish and decidedly not in the faith tradition, not of the covenant. God calls Cyrus his shepherd and approves of some of the stuff that Cyrus is doing. Like, that's good stuff right there. Likewise, in the New Testament, we find that Jesus affirms our responsibility to pay taxes to the Roman government, to the Caesar, to Pontius Pilate, to all of these guys who are going to kill him. We find that St. Paul recommends that we obey governments and be good citizens in his letters, even though, once again, he's going to get in trouble with Rome. The only real temperance to this, the only way in which it's kind of put down, is that we find people like Peter saying that we need to obey God more than we obey governments. When human governments literally call us to sin and say, hey, you should personally do this bad thing, then we don't really have to do it. We find that this happens, well, like I said, in Peter in the book of Acts, but we also find it in the book of Daniel, when Daniel and his friends refuse to worship the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar as a god. So these are great ways to follow God and go against the government, but if it's, something different from that, then you should probably just do it. What it comes down to is that Lutherans believe that governments are good things. They are literally an expression of God's preference for humankind to be in community, for humankind to have responsibility for one another, to be our siblings' keepers. It's God's preference for accountability, and it's done in response to human sinfulness. We are called to restrain real bad things that happen. We're called to do that together. We're called to make this world a less dangerous, less troubling place. So governments are called to act thus as shepherds, to keep us together, to bring us to green pastures, to protect us from wolves and natural dangers, and all of these things. That's the stuff that a good shepherd does. That's what a king is called to do, and by extension, that's what governments are called to do. I like to think of the government, and indeed as of all institutions, as kind of like a trellis. A trellis can lift the plant off of the ground to help it grow, to facilitate its growth, to help it thrive, to produce more fruits, all that good stuff, even protect it a little bit from wildlife. But ultimately, it doesn't have the power to water the plant or to cause it to grow. Luther argues that the state, government, is really an extension of the office of the parents, particularly where a parent lacks a capacity, lacks the physical time, lacks the expertise in labor, lacks any number of things. That's where the parent's authority extends into the government's authority, to the state's authority, to the community's authority. We trust our children, we trust those who are under our charge to others. It's ultimately an expression of trust and community. So here's what Luther says in explaining the fourth commandment in the Large Catechism. All authority flows and is propagated from the authority of parents. For where a father is unable to educate his rebellious and irritable child, he employs a schoolmaster to instruct him. But if he's too weak, he enlists the aid of his friends and neighbors, and if he departs from this life, he delegates and confers his authority and government upon others who are appointed for this purpose. Luther then goes on, all whom we call masters are in the place of parents, and must derive their power and their authority from them. Hence they are all called fathers in the Scriptures, as those who in their government perform the function of a father, and should have a paternal heart towards their subordinates. As also from antiquity, the Romans and other nations called the masters and mistresses of households patres et matres familiae, that is, housefathers and housemothers. So also they called their national rulers and overlords patres patriae, that is, fathers of an entire country. For great shame to us who would be Christians, that we would not likewise call them so, or at least do not esteem or honor them as such. So of course this is the 21st century. The few royalty that we still have in the world aren't really as powerful as they once were. But we still have government, and government fills that role, that call. It's meant to act like a good parent would over the people of a nation. That includes the application of medicine, I would say, since we do believe that illness and death are fundamentally not good things. Illness and death actually threaten the flock. So it would be a bad shepherd who doesn't try to make sure that the flock is healthy and safe. A shot, in this case, is a lot better than a sword in a fight against an evil disease. So too, I would say, is a mask, when we know that masks actually do somehow stop diseases from spreading. Just because a government has fallen short in multiple ways over the centuries doesn't mean that they don't still have these rules against them, put upon them by God. God still wants governments to act well, and we as citizens have every right to call upon governments to do their job. Notice that I'm using these words of job and these words of call. That actually brings us to the next really important point when it comes to how we deal with disease in this world, how we deal with global pandemics. Vocation. Vocation is something like a calling. That's actually the word. It's a calling to a thing. In a lot of traditions, you'll use that as a phrase for one's religious vocation, for people who are called to be clergy, like myself. However, in the Lutheran tradition, we think that vocation is a much bigger thing. We don't limit vocation to those who are seeking to be religious professionals, but everyone is called to certain vocations. Your station in life, your calling in life, your job to an extent, all of these things are actually vocations. You have gifts and skills and a place in life where you're actually called to be there, to serve, to love, to learn, to act, to do all of these things. Children usually have the vocation of student. Some adults have the vocation teacher. Still other adults have the vocation factory worker, or auto mechanic, or teacher, or any number of things. Tax professional, someone who makes it so that you know how much money you actually owe, because I don't have enough time to do all the paperwork myself. We're called to do these things to make one another's lives a lot more manageable and a lot easier, and we're called to support one another in these things. Even stations in life, such as parent, grandparent, child, spouse. These are also vocations. It can even include your hobbies as you live as a Christian in the world. You're actually called to bring yourself into this world and find ways to help. Find ways to bring your gifts so that the world is an easier place. One of the really important vocations, I'm sure you can tell based off of the previous part of this video, is working in civic offices, to work in the government. God has seen fit to send Christians into government offices where they can act for a better state, where they can work together and make the state function in a healthier way, to get what needs to be done, and they can do this without sin. To act, as previously noted, as shepherds for all people, particularly the vulnerable. It's never a sin to try to be a faithful person working in a government office, to go out of your way and to try to make the world safer, to make your community safer. It's not a bad thing to do that. By extension, because we know that the first use of the law is fundamentally active in government itself, we know that God is working good through governments, even though sometimes they seem kind of questionable. Here's another thing. Whether it's due to sin or natural order or whatever, I don't actually know. God has made a world in which there are diseases that can kill people. They're not great. I wouldn't recommend catching any of them. God has also, however, created such a world in which these diseases can be recovered from, can be even cured. God has called people into this world, called an office, a vocation into this world, a way of getting better into this world through the art of doctoring. God has called people to be doctors who take care of people and who make the illnesses of the world a little bit less grave. God has likewise created a world that's filled with an order, filled with secrets, filled with mysteries and strange things that can be crafted and developed and worked with so that medicines come into existence. And so God has called people to be medical researchers, to use their brains and generations of wisdom that predate them, to research and develop medicines, vaccines, treatments that preserve and save lives, that put an end to these deadly illnesses, and that make our lives together a whole lot easier. We say that this is a good thing. As we saw with the government, even if any individual doctor or whatever, researcher or whatever, is faithless, the vocation is still good, and God has pledged to work good through it. God can still work through miraculous and recognizable ways. So we see that government is a good thing. We see that doctors are a good thing. We're actually called to trust that God is at work in these places, through these people. Since medicine, I think, is fundamentally a first use of the law thing in that it restrains evil, I think this means that doctors function kind of as civil servants. They do first use of the law stuff. To that end, actually back in Reformation Germany, physicians were counted as civil authorities. They had a civil office. They weren't just private contractors. They were something more than that. They were more like a law enforcement officer or a constable or a city clerk or a mayor or a judge than they were as, someone operating a private practice. And again, just because the modern government in the United States doesn't treat doctors quite in that way, it's a little bit different. Again, I'm not a specialist in the field, but just because the government doesn't really treat doctors as state employees doesn't mean that a doctor's job isn't ultimately oriented on the restraint of evil, and thus the first use of. So then, understanding that God loves the world and is at work in the world, I think it's a pretty clear line to see that there are tons of faithful doctors and researchers in this world who've done really good work, and in these days have created a vaccine for COVID-19. We should understand that gift as a way in which God has been faithful to us, has been answering our prayers through generations of wisdom. And as it turns out, This isn't the first time that God has brought us through a plague. We've been through plagues before. We've been through all kinds of things before, and the wisdom of those generations actually still kind of stands. So with that, I want to turn our attention to Martin Luther's very own response to the plague in Germany back in 1527. Lutherans have dealt with plagues before. We've dealt with pandemics before. We've dealt with epidemics, all matters of disease. 500 years. Pick a disease. We've dealt with it. And the most straightforward, and I think theologically still unsurpassed text on the matter is Martin Luther's on whether or not one may flee from a deadly plague. A little bit of context. This is happening in 1527 or so, this letter. Martin Luther's first daughter, Magdalena, was born after her mother, Katharina von Bora, Luther's wife, was exposed to the plague. Katharina survived, but Magdalena was born sick and didn't. Shortly after Magdalena's death, Luther wrote that famous hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." When Luther writes that beautiful and painful line, "Were they to take our house, goods, honor, child, or spouse," he's referring to a person. He's referring to Magdalena, who didn't make it, and Catalina, who almost didn't. In those days, Luther received a letter from the Reverend Dr. Johann Hess, who was just a few towns over, asking whether or not someone should flee the city. After all, social distancing. Good advice then, good advice now. In that time, there were two schools of thought that Hess was contemplating between. One argued that Christians should remain in the city and face a plague as though it were God's punishment, that if they die, they die, and if they don't, they're loved. And that running away in one way or the other would be a faithless thing. The other side argued that to run away was a reasonable thing if you don't hold a civic office, that is, a vocation that's entrusted to you for a specific care of citizens, first use of law. Clearly, Luther actually agreed with the latter half, saying that if your affairs are in order, if your job is covered, if the kids who are in your charge all have someone to look after them, it's perfectly fine to go away. In fact, it might even be advisable, as long as the people who depend on you have someone they can turn to. Luther observes that this is the line of thought that St. Athanasius followed when, in the 4th century, there was a plague infecting his city. He likewise says that, in a way, that's kind of what St. Paul did when he fled Damascus in Acts 9:25. He was facing certain death. It was at the hands of others, not at the hands of a plague, but he still was facing certain death, so he ran away. We find that line of thought is followed also by Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, from both Saul and later Absalom, and a bunch of prophets as well. You can actually run away and not face death for a while. It'll catch up to you in time. But if you're facing certain death, you can go away from it. You don't have to die where you are. Running away from a certain death, no matter its form, isn't a bad thing. It's in fact a good thing, and countless people have done it before. The position on staying, though, well, that's the meat of Luther's letter. Luther says that it's a good thing to stay in a city and to do one's job, to do one's duty, to face death bravely and do what you got to do. Christ, after all, does not want the weak ones who are stuck in a city to be endangered or abandoned. That is, after all, good shepherd stuff. But that's exactly the thing. Jesus doesn't want the weak ones to be endangered. That means we're actually committed to seeking one another's well-being, whatever that form takes. Luther went on to say that if one believes that a plague is in God's hands, and that it is simply God's judgment, and that we must accept all of these things in the name of faith without changing any behavior or conduct or pursuing treatment or preventative measures or anything like that, if you're going to approach the plague like that, well then if your house is on fire, you should probably just lay in bed, right? Might not kill you. Might be a sign of tremendous faith if you just laid in your bed while the fire surrounded you. After all, that fire might just be God's punishment, right? In the same way, if you fall overboard on a ship, you fall into the deep water, you would dare not try swimming away, but rather must surrender to the water as a divine punishment. Luther's words, not mine. As you can clearly guess, Luther doesn't think very highly of that position. To respond to clear and present danger in that way isn't faith. It's lunacy. It's foolishness. It is the denial of vocation, the denial of talent, the denial of skill, of ministry, and indeed of life. By that track of thinking, you shouldn't eat when you're starving or drink when you're dying of thirst. Luther felt that even worse were fools who went around already knowing that they were sick and trying to spread the disease, assuming that if they got other people sick, then the judgment goes further and perhaps even they themselves would get better. That entire train of thought isn't all that different from people who pursue herd immunity, by the way. Look, we can't faithfully approach a pandemic like that. We owe it to God and to our neighbor to treasure and protect and preserve life. Look, if God wants us dead, we're going to die. In fact, we're going to die at some point anyway. But we should live knowing that God is gracious and merciful, and that God actually calls us to love and to serve. Frankly, we will never earn our condemnation by seeking to preserve our lives and the lives of others by the means that God has provided for us to do that with. We would just be following God and doing what we've been told in loving our neighbor. So to that end, it's actually good when we keep hospitals prepared for the sick, when we take medicines that are prescribed to us, when we respect preventative measures such as social distancing, wearing masks, and doing the things that are proven to work, all things that Luther himself recommended back then, actually. Even though we didn't have germ or viral theory, even though we had weird beliefs about how diseases happened, the ways to remediate them have remained actually pretty consistent in a lot of ways. By the way, plague doctor masks, the masks that they wore back then, looked a lot cooler than the ones we wear today. To not take advantage of these means to stop diseases, to not take advantage of what research has given us, what medicine has given us, Luther believed was rash, reckless, and actually tempting God. It's not a faithful thing to turn away all of the things that God has given us in our world and insist that God heal us by supernatural means. That's not why God created the world. To deny treatment, to deny medicine, to deny the things that God has given us, likewise denies the ministry and the vocation of God's faithful and beloved doctors, apothecaries, nurses, researchers, all these things. People who ignore the means of controlling a disease, Luther argues, are ultimately murderers because they're not protecting their neighbor. They're not doing the things that make someone's life more secure. So, as we're dealing with a pandemic, we should pretty much do what, well, I've been calling y'all to do, what you all have heard you should do. Use every means available to combat the plague. Pray. Be there for the people who need you, and otherwise keep your distance until it's gone. That's how we deal with plagues, through responsibility and through love for our neighbors, to put our wants aside for the needs of those around us. So how do we live with these things in mind? How do we bring these teachings into our daily life in these days? First things first, I think every Christian should get vaccinated. You don't risk sinning by getting vaccinated, but you in fact really do risk sinning by not getting vaccinated. After all, if the vaccine is effective, which it is, every meaningful study shows that it is, not always in preventing you from getting sick, but usually in preventing you from getting deadly sick or extra sick or any number of things. It keeps the symptoms down. And that's really good because that keeps hospitals emptier, so people who are in real danger get the real big help. Every Christian should get vaccinated. It's just a good thing. Likewise, Christians should continue wearing masks as long as trained and informed civic authorities keep recommending it. As long as that's the majority of the feedback that we're getting, wearing a mask doesn't hurt you. Wearing a mask does help your neighbor. To do these things is actually a good work. It keeps hospitals emptier, it prevents infections, it shows that you value the lives of your neighbors. And honestly, it means approaching the world with trust that God is actually doing good through the first use of the law, even in organizations that we might be otherwise skeptical of. It's been made clear time and time again that the practices that we're using to mitigate COVID-19 are very low risk. But if your doctor has a reason to suspect that you personally cannot safely receive the vaccine due to some pre-existing medical condition, then you're actually exempt. Then everyone else's practice will keep you safer. And in those cases, you should still probably wear a mask. So what does this mean about vaccine mandates for the entire US population? Something that is, being bandied around a little bit. Well, that's tricky. You and I have, of course, been trained in a lot of ways in our culture to be skeptical of authority and overreaches of authority. But when we think about the first use of the law and what God asks with the first use of the law, what God commands with the first use of the law, with the role of the government in the first use of the law, and how the government has used vaccines in previous generations, I think we should understand that the government actually has a theological right to do this. Whether that's a constitutional right, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I can't tell you. But I don't think it's authoritarian to make people get a vaccine any more than it's authoritarian to make a person drive on the right side of the road. At the end of the day, if we live together, we have to live for each other. We have to live in community with each other and in communion with each other. When we fail to look after our neighbor and look for our own self-asserted rights against the well-being of our neighbors, we commit a real dangerous sin. As I've been developing this video, I've come across a few counterpoints and a few claims that I disagree with that I think I'm going to lift up here for just a second. Sometimes Christians say that they have a right by Christian authority, by their own Christian faith, they have a right to make the choice for themselves, and that a government can't make them take a vaccine. Once again, the first use of the law kind of debunks this. Governments have a right to restrain evil. But there's this troubling underlying claim that being a Christian gives you a unique right. That's not a true claim. This line of argumentation ends up resembling what the 12 Articles of the 16th century, a text rejected by Martin Luther, argued for. The 12 Articles were this collection of demands from farmers, as well as a few false prophets, who demanded that their territorial princes must give them everything they want because the farmers are Christians and they deserve all good things on earth because they're Christians. And if the farmers didn't get what they were asking for, indeed because they already weren't getting what they were asking for, these same farmers had the right to lead violent insurrections against the princes who stood in the way of their freedom. In Luther's Admonition to Peace, Luther lays out pretty clearly that this is the opposite of what Jesus did. Jesus never killed anyone or tried to overthrow a state by violence. Likewise, he never said that to become a Christian is to demand that the world caters to your every whim. Instead, Jesus clearly says, take up your cross and follow me. Since the farmers were, in the name of Jesus, starting to murder people, Luther called upon the princes to stop them by the power of the sword. The princes did this with, frankly, way too much vigor and way not enough discretion. The princes were terrible. But to Luther, being a Christian gives you the grounds to advocate for the well-being of your neighbor, to behave faithfully, and to suffer alongside people, to the shame and the discredit of their oppressors. Being a Christian doesn't mean that the state or anyone has to cater to your demands or bring you to rise up in violent insurrection. There is space for civic and civil disobedience and resistance, both in the Bible and in the Lutheran tradition. We can talk about that at another time, though, because rejecting vaccines and masks and working against the government as it tries to protect the lives of the vulnerable just isn't a defensible theological take. Another bad argument I've heard has been that to get a vaccine should be a free choice because it should be a good work to get a vaccine. And that by mandating it, by making it compulsory, a government will prevent it from being counted as a good work. I think that's nonsense. Consider this counterpoint. If I'm terrible to my wife, she'll divorce me. And that will cause ruin for me, spiritually, socially, financially, in all sorts of ways. It would be bad for me to get divorced because I love my wife. But me loving her and being kind to her and looking out for her isn't something I do out of compulsion. It's something I do because I love her. I try to be a good husband, even though there is an actual consequence attached to me being a bad one. In theological terms, like we laid out earlier, the first use of the law is not negated by the third use of the law. A third point that I've heard to try to undercut this whole video is that the United States isn't Lutheran and thus it shouldn't care about Lutheran theology. Look, just because the United States doesn't have a Lutheran state church, and just because it probably won't make a formal mandate, doesn't mean that these things aren't still active. If a state resists God's will for what government is supposed to do, that doesn't mean that the state is being good. It's not a sign of merit, we'll say. In theological terms, truth and responsibility aren't contingent upon falsity and irresponsibility. To sum things up, I think that we speak about vaccinations wrongly when we talk about vaccines in terms of choice. We shouldn't be viewing things in terms of choice. We should be viewing things in terms of vocation, call, duty, responsibility. So get your vaccines. Wear masks for the sake of your neighbors. Getting vaccines is a good work. It's not a sin. God has made medicine for a reason, and to be a doctor or a medical researcher is a vocation. Likewise, governments have this theological ground to put a mandate in there to try to restrain this thing from hurting others. And ultimately, at the end of the day, all we can do is trust that God will not fail us, and that God will not fail in God's pursuit of justice. So for that reason, we're called to live together in this world for everyone's well-being. So thanks for watching today. This is a much longer video than normal, but I hope this helps you know generally how Lutherans approach civics and ethics, that we always put God and our neighbor before we put ourselves, that we listen to people in vocation, through vocation, that we're called to be loyal to one another and to love one another and to act in one another's interest, to trust that God is at work in the world and hasn't just left us here alone. So I hope to see you next time as we continue our read-through of the Lord's Prayer and how that informs our prayer life and our life together. And with that, see you around.